Hi everyone, welcome to lesson 1.6. Please make sure to fill in your guided notes as we go along. So last lesson, we talked about the flow of energy, okay? And then today we're going to be talking about cycles of matter. So unlike the one-way flow of energy, matter is recycled within and between ecosystems. Biogeochemical cycles are elements, chemical compounds, and other forms of matter which are passed from one organism to another and from one part of the biosphere to another. Human activity can also play an important role in these cycles. The flow of matter can involve the following processes: biological, geological, chemical and physical, and human activity. So each of these processes, biological is going to consist of anything performed by living organisms. That includes eating, breathing, burning food, eliminating waste. So anything that has to do with something living. Geological processes are going to include volcanic eruptions, formation and breakdown of rock, and major movements of matter within and below the surface of the Earth. Chemical and physical processes will include the formation of clouds, precipitation, flow of running water, and action of lightning. Human activity would include the mining and burning of fossil fuels, clearing of land for building and farming, and manufacture and use of fertilizers. So we're going to discuss the following cycles of matter. We're going to talk about the water cycle, and we're also going to talk about nutrient cycles. And the nutrient cycles that we are going to discuss are the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. And then as we go through each of these matter cycles, you may be asked to identify biological, geological, chemical, and physical, and human activity components of each. Now, what's important to remember is this lesson tends to get a little confusing and overwhelming just because it seems like a lot of information, which it is, but you do not have to memorize the components of all of these cycles. You would either be given a diagram or choices, and you just need to use logic to understand which component of each cycle we are asking for. So again, as we go through, you do not have to memorize these diagrams. You just need to be able to interpret the diagrams and to correctly assign biological, geological, and chemical, physical, and human activity components of each cycle. So the first one is the water cycle. And we know every time you see rain, snow, watch a river, you are witnessing part of the water cycle. All living things on Earth require water, which enters the atmosphere as a gas. Water cycles among the oceans, atmosphere, and land, sometimes outside living organisms and sometimes inside them. Okay, so this comes to our first check for understanding. So we're going to take a closer look at the water cycle. You're going to identify what is the biological component, okay, or the purple component here in this diagram, and what are the physical and chemical processes in the cycle, and how are humans involved in the cycle. So again, this aspect, this here, you do not have to memorize these diagrams. You would be given these diagrams. You just need to be able to interpret what is the biological or physical chemical process. So I want you to pause here and take a minute to look at this diagram and try to answer this. Okay, so the biological, the purple arrow here, is showing groundwater is taken up by plant roots and then through transpiration released into the atmosphere. So remember, biological is anything living, plants are living, therefore that is the biological aspect. What are the physical and chemical processes in the cycle? Water from oceans and lakes evaporates and then condenses to form clouds. Water falls to the surface as precipitation, and some water seeps back into the ground and becomes groundwater. Okay, so you follow this whole red arrow, that would be the chemical portion, okay, or the physical and chemical portion. And then last, how are humans involved in the water cycle? Water is vital to life, and we use water every day. Now we're going to move on to the carbon cycle. So carbon is a major component of all organic molecules, including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. As we get into Unit 2 for biomolecules, you're going to be seeing a lot more carbon. Carbon is a key ingredient to living tissue and ecosystems, and Earth is often described as carbon-based life. Coal, oil, and gas are called fossil fuels because they are essentially fossilized carbon. Now your next check for understanding. Okay, so you're going to look at this diagram and you're going to try to describe a biological component, geological, chemical, and human activity that is involved in the carbon cycle using this diagram. Okay, so again, don't have to memorize this diagram. You're just going to pause here, examine the arrows, and then try to break down what's happening for each component. Okay, so for this biological component here, this purple, carbon dioxide is taken up by producers during photosynthesis and released by cellular respiration. Consumers eat producers and release carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. So again, you're involving living things here with the carbon cycle. For the green component, volcanic activity releases carbon into the atmosphere and geological activity turns marine sediments into rock. So here you have dissolved CO2, marine sediments, and then released through this volcano. Physical and chemical, that's this red portion. So carbon dioxide is dissolved in rainwater. It's dissolved in oceans and returns to the atmosphere. And then last, the human portion right here, we have fossil fuels as well as forest. So burning of forest and fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. Now, microbes in the carbon cycle. So carbon in the form of CO2 has to be transformed into a usable organic form by living organisms. So we have cyanobacteria, which are also known as blue-green algae, and phytoplankton, and those are two types of bacteria that can obtain energy through photosynthesis. And they also introduce oxygen into Earth's early atmosphere. Phytoplankton are the foundation of the oceanic food chain, and they produce more than half of the world's atmosphere's oxygen. Both cyanobacteria and phytoplankton remove an enormous amount of carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, if you recall from that last lesson. Now we're going to get into the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is an essential in the composition of amino acids. Nitrogen gas, which is N2, is the main component of the atmosphere, but few organisms can use that form of nitrogen, which is the N2 gas. It has to be converted to a usable form, such as ammonia, by organisms that can fix nitrogen. And so some nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in soil and on the roots of plants. So the two processes, nitrogen fixation is the process by which certain bacteria can convert nitrogen gas into ammonia. So that's the usable form that we can use. And denitrification is the process by which certain bacteria obtain energy by converting nitrates into nitrogen gas, which is released into the atmosphere. So these two processes right here are basically opposites of each other. Okay, this is taking gas, converting it to ammonia. This is taking those nitrates and converting it back into nitrogen gas. So more about microorganisms' role in the ecosystem. Prokaryotes are essential in maintaining every aspect of ecological balance in the living world. By breaking down dead organisms, we release essential nutrients back into the environment. Photosynthetic prokaryotes like cyanobacteria also account for more than half of the primary production in oceans. And then last, nitrogen-fixing bacteria provide 90% of the nitrogen used by other organisms. Now, this is your check for understanding on the nitrogen cycle. So go ahead, examine this diagram, and then pause here and you're going to answer these questions. All right, check for understanding. So number one, if nitrogen makes up 78% of Earth's atmosphere, explain why it's scarce in ecosystems and it's not usable by most living things. So this one had a little bit of research. We haven't discussed that yet, but if you look that up, nitrogen gas, N2, is a relatively stable gas, and it's held together by a triple covalent bond. We know triple covalent bonds are much more difficult to break than a double bond or a single bond. Because that bond, that triple bond that N2 has, is difficult to break, bacteria have to convert this gas into a usable form for us before we can use that. Where do nitrogen-fixing bacteria live? Number two, some nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in soil and on the roots of plants. Number three, identify a biological component of the nitrogen cycle. So we can follow these purple arrows here, and you see there is quite a few to choose from. So you only had to choose one, but bacteria fix nitrogen gas. It's taken up by primary producers, reused by consumers, and released by excretion and decomposing matter. And then bacteria also release gas through denitrification. Number 4, identify a human activity component of the nitrogen cycle. So that's going to be these yellow, orange arrows. So gas is turned into fertilizer and applied to crops. Excess may wash into rivers, streams, and the ocean as runoff. And then last, identify a physical or chemical component of the cycle. And here you have this red arrow, and some gas can be fixed by lightning. Obviously, that's a little bit more rare. It's mostly done by that bacteria, but it can happen. Now we're on to the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is very rare in the biosphere and is found mostly in rocks and minerals in an inorganic state. Most phosphorus is released through erosion, so we know that that's going to take a really long time. Phosphorus is essential to life because it is part of molecules such as ATP, DNA, and RNA. And as we kind of learn about the structures of these three, you will see that all three of those have phosphorus groups. Unlike carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, phosphorus does not cycle through the atmosphere. So on this check for understanding, go ahead, pause here, and see if you can interpret this diagram, identify a biological, purple, geological, green, and human activity, this orange or yellow, involved in the phosphorus cycle. So pause and try it out. Okay, so for the check yourself, phosphorus for the biological component is taken up by primary producers, reused by consumers, and released by excretion and decomposing matter. Geological, or the green portion, phosphates are washed from rock in the ocean, and marine sediments are turned into rock. And then the last one, the human aspect, the orange arrow, phosphorus is mined, turned into fertilizer, and applied to crops, and some excess may wash into rivers, streams, and the ocean as runoff. So, couple last things, nutrient limitation. So if ample sunlight, water, everything that you need in that ecosystem is available, the primary productivity of an ecosystem may still be limited by the availability of nutrients. So even if a single essential nutrient is in short supply, primary productivity will be limited. So here, limiting nutrient, this is a vocabulary term. This one's going to be pretty easy to remember. It's the nutrient whose supply limits productivity. Some common limiting nutrients include nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. So for example, most fertilizers contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which helps plant grow better in poor soil. So pause here, kind of think to yourself, how can too much fertilizer disrupt natural nutrient cycles? So one thing that can happen is if you apply too much fertilizer, the plant can grow too fast and it won't have a stable root system and it won't be able to draw up enough water. So even though it's growing, it hasn't had time to actually catch up to that growth. And then last, in aquatic ecosystems, nitrogen is often the limiting nutrient. Think, how might excess nitrogen disrupt an aquatic ecosystem? And here's your hint. Okay, algal blooms can often be caused by an influx of a limiting nutrient, and that can disrupt the equilibrium of a whole ecosystem. So limiting nutrients, it is good to have them so that way the ecosystem is not thrown off by an abundance of a certain nutrient. So that is the end of lesson 1.6. Make sure that you have all of your vocabulary down in your notes. And again, this lesson tends to be a little bit more confusing just because the amount of information. You do not have to memorize any of those cycle charts or any of those cycle pictures. You just need to be able to interpret them if you are given a picture or you're asked to identify a certain component. Please feel free to reach out to your teacher with any questions, and thank you again for listening.